Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today we're going to be doing an episode that I've been buzzing for for a long time, to be completely honest. Going to be doing an episode on the history and heritage of Union Berlin, and to help me do that, I'm joined by author Kit Holden.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah.
It's a pleasure to have you on, man. As I said, it's an episode that I've been really excited to do for quite a long time. They're a club that I enjoy watching, a club that I think have really captured the hearts of a lot of people over the last couple of seasons with the trajectory that they've been on. And as we'll go on to discuss, that was something that you touched on a little bit in your book as well. And I suppose that's quite a good place to start. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, first of all?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a freelance football writer, journalist living in Berlin. I'm originally from the UK, and I've been here for about 10 years. And yeah, I cover German football for English and German media. And yeah, as I say, I've been in Berlin for about 10 years. And when I came, I was one of quite a few people in that generation, if you like, who sort of started to go into Union because it was the second division team, and it was a little bit more interesting than Hertha maybe, who were kind of mid-table Bundesliga at that time. And sort of fell in love with them a little bit, and then over the years I started writing about them as well for various people. And I kind of always thought, well, this club has a really special story. It's a really fascinating history, a really unique history, and at some point somebody needs to write a book about it in English. And they got promoted in 2019, and I thought, well, okay, this is the one chance, because they're going to have 1 year in the top flight and go straight back down again. So if anyone's going to do the book, it's got to be now. And then, yeah, 5 years later, they're playing Real Madrid in the Champions League. So that's the long and short of it, really.
Yeah, it's been a crazy journey for them. As I said, their rise has been pretty meteoric over the last few years, but it sounds like it's been a really fascinating journey for yourself as well. As you'd mentioned in your book, it was a club that a lot of people went to see because they were a little bit more bohemian. Dare I say a little bit more hipster as well. No, I'm only joking, but you know, it was a club that were a little bit lower down the divisions, and that's what people would go and see. And I mean, it sounds like it's a great atmosphere, and we're really going to be diving into quite a lot of elements in this, like our athletic club episode, where you know, politics and identity and heritage kind of played a big part in that. It does as well for Union, but for completely different reasons as well, because as we'll come on to talk about, they tend to stay away from politics and political identity in favour of kind of just having a good time. But, you know, within that, there's different elements and different layers and different facets as well. And that's part of the reason that I wanted to do this episode, is because they're such a fascinating club. They've got a fantastic story. Of course, we need to start somewhere, and we need to start at the beginning, which is the history of them. And what I quite like, just sorry for our listeners, just to make you aware, Kit wrote a book called Scheiss, We Are Going Up, which really covered the story of Union Berlin and their rise through the divisions. And what I liked about the book was how it began, because it really starts with these kind of fan tales and these fan stories of how they supported Union through the East German era and through the Stasi era. But before that, they had quite a long history, and there's a couple of points that I'd like to touch on. So, Kip, if you want to kick things off, I'd be more than happy for you to start when Union were founded, if you like.
Yeah, so I suppose it's kind of hard to say when Union were founded, because officially, with this name and with these colours and with this badge and the kind of general construct that we'd recognise Union now, they were founded in 1966 as part of a kind of wave of foundings and refoundings and restructurings that the East German football authorities were doing at the time. But in fact, like a lot of East German clubs and like a lot of German clubs generally, they have a sort of a longer tradition and roots that go a bit further back. So, I mean, they initially, they can probably trace themselves back to 1906 when a club called Olympia Oberschöneweide were founded. Oberschöneweide is sort of in the southeast of Berlin, which is pretty much where Union still are. And they very quickly were renamed Union Oberschöneweide, and in the whole time up to the Second World War, basically, Union Oberschöneweide were one of, not the biggest club in Berlin, but one of a few Berlin clubs that were occasionally sniffing around what was then a kind of championship playoff. In the national championship, you had regional leagues and then a national championship done by playoffs at the end of the season. And Union Ob, as they were called, were they played in blue and white, weirdly not red and white as we know now. And their sort of great success was they got to the final of the German Championship 1 year in 1923. And apart from that, they were a relatively normal, bog standard, early 20th century German club. Not too much special about them. And a lot of the kind of mythology about that time and the traditions of that club were arguably kind of painted onto them a bit later when the Cold War era comes around and the division of Berlin after the Second World War.
Yeah, you mentioned it at the beginning. Union can trace their history back to 1906 with the founding of what would become the Union Ob as well. And there's many other clubs that we've covered who've done that as well. But essentially, the context behind it, after World War II, Allied forces effectively told pretty much every sporting club and other organisations in Germany to disband, and new ones were founded. And this is how Union came about. And they had a couple of different names when the refounding began, and they actually had a West Berlin branch as well. I think it was just the Union Sports Club or something along those lines that they were called, and then obviously Union Berlin were the Eastern branch. And then things really started to begin. And again, the fan stories that were mentioned in your book about growing up supporting Union in that era in East Germany and having, running battles against the police and things like that, it's really, really fascinating. And I think that's where my fascination for Union certainly began, is that it kind of starts off in this era of East Germany where you've got oppression, you have all these other elements on top of it, and then you've just got these people who want to watch football.
Yeah, I think, just to sort of go back, perhaps worth giving a bit of context about that kind of period just after the Second World War. As you say, the Allies initially on all sides disbanded the clubs, and then what happened was in the West, pretty quickly the Allied powers said, okay, no, you can refound under certain conditions, and pretty quickly most of the old traditional clubs went back to their old identities and became what they had been before the war. In the East, it was different. There was a much more concerted effort to say, no, okay, we're going to refound all these clubs under different identities. They're going to have very socialist names. They're going to be completely restructured. They're all going to be part of sporting communities, sporting associations, which have chess departments and cycling departments and table tennis departments and everything. And the result of that and the kind of constant tinkering that the East German authorities were doing in the 50s particularly meant that you had all these identity changes, like you say. So Union went through about 7 or 8 different names, and that was quite normal for East German clubs at the time. The Western Union team, again, just worth picking up on that, because that's an interesting story. At this time, in the kind of early 50s, still you had, in effect, 2 states, but the East German state wasn't recognized yet by the West German state. So you still had slightly porous things in things like football, slightly porous borders. So technically Union Berlin, or what they were renamed Union Oberschöneweide at that point for a short amount of time, and they reached what was technically the national German final, which was essentially the West German national final. And they weren't allowed to attend by the East German authorities. So that's why the Western Union team started, because a lot of players said, well, if we're not allowed to attend, then we're going to go over to the West and compete that championship as a Western team. And that club still exists. It's called Union Berlin. It's called Union Neues Berlin, and they play in West Berlin in blue and white. And they have a sort of distant but relatively cordial relationship with what is now Union Berlin in the East. And I think the other bit of context that's worth noting is when the East German authorities started refounding and creating these new clubs, there was a drive as well to say, okay, they have to be tied to, firstly, you can't have privately owned clubs, so they have to be, and you can't have private members clubs. That's a bourgeois construct, so they're going to be tied to state-owned enterprises. So you had clubs like Hansa Rostock that were with the shipping, the state-owned shipping enterprise. You had any club called Dynamo, as anywhere else in the Eastern Bloc was a police club, and by extension a secret police club, and had the support of the Stasi. Any club called Vorwärts, again, is very common as a army club name. And Union were founded in 66 as I say, in the wave of kind of restructurings that happened then, as the civilian club in Berlin. So there was BFC Dynamo, who were the big police club. There was Vorwärts Berlin, the army club, and Union were, because there was one party bigwig who was already a bit of an Union fan, said, no, we've got to have Union in there as one of these top 10 elite clubs, and they're going to be the civilian club. And they were tied, well, officially to the local electronics factory, but in practice they were the trade union club. That was their kind of shtick, and that I guess gave them a little bit of a kind of an aura from the start of we're the good guys, we're the ordinary people. We're just going to the football every weekend. We're not tied to obviously we're tied to the state. Everything's tied to the state in a communist country, but we're not tied to the nasty bits of the state like the police or the army or something like that. And over the years, that became a much more kind of crystallized thing. Vorwärts were moved to another city in the early 70s. BFC Dynamo, the Stasi club, were more and more throughout the late 70s and 80s became the kind of ultimate power, the sort of Bayern Munich of East Germany, if you like, who were unbeatable, partly because they were just, all the resources were funded towards them. And that rivalry within the city of Berlin became more and more emotional as a kind of Union of the ordinary person's club, and BFC, the elite of the communist state. And so, yeah, you have these to get to your initial point, you have these amazing fan stories from the 60s onwards, basically, and particularly in the 60s and 70s, you begins to develop a kind of nascent East German fan culture, which, like a lot of East German pop culture, is sort of based on what they're looking at in the West and what's happening at the West at that time, but it's kind of slightly warped because they can only get scraps of magazines and bits of West German TV, and you don't really have much contact. So it also has its own kind of flavor. And Union in the 70s were kind of a hippie club in many ways. I mean, there's a sort of subculture in East Germany known as the Trampers, which essentially means hitchhiker, or the Bluesers. And they had their kind of uniform of these sort of green Parker trench coats, American military Parkers, sandals, and very strange kind of long Hessian bags with pictures of stags on them. It's from today's perspective, it doesn't make any sense, but at the time it was the coolest thing to do. And that was the look for hardcore Union fans, and long hair, crucially, that was big, because that was frowned upon, and that was a way of saying, look, we're sticking it to the state effectively, and sticking it to the norms of this quite restrictive society, and it's worth differentiating. That's why I start with the fans, because the fans are what give Union its kind of aura, and this idea of it being a rebel club, and which has been picked up and made them into, as you say, a kind of hipster thing. The club itself was never anti-state. The club itself was never a resistance, a hub of resistance, or a dissident club. But you had this thing where, because they were the people's club, if you like, if you were a football fan and you wanted to express some kind of distaste with the state, you were more likely to end up at Union than you were at BFC or Vorwärts, which is not to say there were no dissidents in those fan scenes, and it's not to say everyone in the Union fan scene was a dissident, but that was the kind of general feeling. And yeah, I tried to speak to a good, because it changes over the years as well, what that means. And as I say, you had this Bluesers Trampers thing in the 70s. By the 80s, it's looking a lot different, and you've got a lot more violence in the football stadiums. You've got a lot more disillusionment generally in East German society. People have very far fewer perspectives by the time the 80s roll around, and the economic situation is what it is. Far right hooliganism is rising, and far right influences are rising everywhere, and that's also true of the Union fan base. There's a lot more violence generally, so it changes, it morphs over the years. But this kind of idea of we as the fans are sticking it to something bigger is a kind of consistent through Union's journey in the DDR. So that's why I picked out those fan stories, and I mean, most of them are completely and utterly subjective, shall we say, and people do like to kind of tell their story and ham it up, and then you'll always have someone going, that can't be true, that's ridiculous, that would never have happened. But that's part of the fun of it, and that's part of the sort of mythology of this club, is that people have these epic stories about how Union taught them to disrespect authority and to value freedom in an unfree society. So.
Yeah, exactly, and there's so much to just kind of pick apart there, and so much to talk about, and from a heritage perspective as well as other perspectives as well. I mean, first and foremost, I think it's quite important that you mentioned the differentiation between club and fan, and it's always something that I'm quite keen to push as well, is that, well, the club is the vehicle for fans to express their identities and their values, etc., etc. It doesn't necessarily mean that the club is on their side either. So when we talk about Union Berlin being a rebel club, it's not as black and white as that. It's a little muddier, especially moving into the era of modern football. We've been over this before in other episodes, where it's something that it's always kind of the fans that are driving this forward, and it's the fans that are the people they're the front face of the club, and that means that they're the ones that are going to be, I suppose, encapsulating the club's identity in that sense as well. But also, when you mentioned that these stories that are told, not only is it the story of Union, because it is history, but it's oral history, and it's people discussing the things that they have engaged with through their football club. It's the things that people have saw while they went to support their football club, and I think that's really important as well, because it's not just this act of hitting points like they were founded in this year and they done this in this year and then this happened and then that happened. It's like, well, I went to this game, I punched a member of this DDR police, I got in huge shit for it, but I loved it because it's my football club. Those are the kind of stories that you want. And yeah, as you said, it's the types of things that aren't ever going to be believable. It's crazy stories, and everyone who is a football fan will have stories of their dad or their mum or their uncle or whoever talking about wild stories they have. I mean, the guy that I go to the football with, he told me when he was following Celtic away in Europe that one of his friends stole a photo, like a massive portrait of the Last Supper from a pub in Italy, and it's like, no, he didn't. But he's adamant, and they're always going to push it because it's their football stories, And I think that's something that makes it really special as well. But the final point that I wanted to make as well was that, as you mentioned, and again, as we go on in the years, we need to remember that football clubs have a life of their own as well, and different people view that football club based on how they grew up and what their values were. So for Union, fans growing up in the 60s and 70s supporting them are going to look at the club completely differently to fans nowadays, and I think that's something that we all need to take into consideration when we're talking about football history more generally.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a big kind of. I'll probably get onto this a little bit more later, but it's one of the big kind of problems that Union have now is how do you articulate an identity that is relevant both to the old guys who started going in the 60s and 70s in East Germany and my generation of effectively Western European hipsters who have kind of adopted them, and that's clearly there's the two life experiences which are diametrically opposed within white male football fandom, but it's. I think what they've tried to do, and I think it's an interesting thing, is to say, look, the continuity here is that the stadium is a space of letting go and letting go of normal life and the pressures and the kind of frustrations of normal life. And this is a place where you come and there's a song that they play just before the official club anthem at every home game, and it's in Berlin dialect, and the lyrics are sort of, they're saying, this is my home, this is where I can be who I actually am, this is where I can swear and I can sing, and I can, and that song is always sung with gusto by everyone because it does encapsulate a little bit, and I think that is still very important to Union today, that idea that the stadium is a free space. You can do stuff that you wouldn't normally do on the street in wider society, whatever. You can say things, you can shout, you can sing, you can, and that's and obviously there are limits and boundaries to that, of course. But yeah, I think that's a big thing that really does have its roots at that time, where this was one of the few spaces where people could go and because sheer safety in numbers, you could go and shout down with the wall, at a free kick. Where if you'd said that on the street, then you'd be in big trouble. So it's an interesting kind of how do you take that, something, a thought that began in a very, very different and in many ways worse society, or more oppressive society at least. How do you translate that into our modern day Germany?
Exactly, and there's lots of comparisons that you can draw to other countries within the former Eastern Bloc as well, where football played a huge role in revolutions and war and uprisings. Yugoslavia being the one that comes to mind. The moment with Zvonimir Boban, where he fly kicks that police officer, and there's riots in the stand and unrest and all this. And I think it's important to kind of highlight that fact that Union and their identity comes from this sort of ideology that they had, that this stadium is your space, and for 90 minutes you can be like the rest of us, you can be who you want to be, it's your safe space, you can sing and chant what you want, because it's the way that we look at that concept now is that, okay, I've had a bad week, go to the football at the end of it, 90 minutes or 2 hours where I can just chill out and I'm focusing on one thing, which is great. But when you're living under an oppressive state, such as the DDR, that's completely different. That concept completely changes because it becomes this place where you can almost just like let your shoulders down a little bit. You can untense. You don't need to be watching your back all the time. And, it just becomes this thing that becomes so important to people's lives because they can genuinely just be who they want to be and sing what they want to sing for 90 minutes. And I think it's quite important to discuss that as well. But, again, all around the former Eastern Bloc, there were occasions like this, and there's football clubs like this where they become anti-establishment in a lot of ways, but not necessarily political, and it's all because of the conditions that they found themselves in and the conditions that led to their founding and their fans essentially having the values and identity that they ended up becoming.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think that in many ways you can differentiate a little bit. I mean, I've had the conversation a few times with the club historian at Union, where he sort of says, it's ridiculous, this idea that we're a dissident club just because we had hippies and punkers on the terraces. I mean, can you imagine, how scared the East German state and the Stasi were that all of us were putting on our jeans and not cutting our hair, And he's got a point, right? But at the same time, I think there is a continuity in that thing of as you were saying, to today, you can go to the football at the end of the week and you can just let your hair down a little bit and relax. But I think in the context of East Germany, at least, and I couldn't really speak for any other Eastern Bloc country, but I think it is almost by definition more confrontational fan culture, and that's partly just to do with the time, and that was true in the West as well to a certain extent. But that idea of freedom and that idea that the stadium is a safe space is by definition a more confrontational thing than it is in our modern football and our modern society. And therefore, it takes on a much more confrontational hue, if you like. And that's down to, when you mentioned the story about the guy, being locked up in the cell because he's punched a police officer on an away game. That, he was unlucky that day, in as way he sees it, and that, he was drunk enough and stupid enough to be caught. But they were constantly going at the police. That was part of the thing, and that was just a reality of going to a game at that time. And I think that's a very different kind of freedom, if you like. A, because it's more restricted, and B, because it is saying we're taking this space, and it's an aggressive move to say, no, we can do what we want here, and you can't stop us. You can surround us, and you can maybe pursue us after the game, but right now you can't stop us. And that there is a little bit of that in modern fan culture, but I don't think it's as inherent. I think it's much more, as you say, about that kind of, we're all come together at the end of the weekend, we can forget taxes and bereavements and whatever, and just kind of have a nice time for a few hours and shut off. And so, I think it's interesting how those things develop, and people have, then you see it in the modern stadium that people expect different things from a football match and a football crowd because they've come at different times in different generations.
Exactly. There's all these different, I suppose, if you look at it in the context of East Germany, every stadium for the most part is like a powder keg, and it's whether or not it's just waiting for that one catalyst to go off. And like you said there, and importantly as well, it was a really good point. Every time you go into a space, and if you are clashing with police, then there's a dialogue going on there, and it's a dialogue that's saying, this is our space, so we're taking it, and you don't have control over us here. And within the context of the Eastern Bloc, that is very, very important, especially where football and fan protest is concerned. But of course, this is where the rivalry, just to go back to the club and the football side of things, this is where the rivalry with Dynamo really comes from, because while Union Berlin are sort of becoming this anti-establishment club, Dynamo are the club of the police, and their fans, again, as you said, not all of them, but for the most part, they support what the club is coming from, and the kind of, I suppose, state institution that they've come from as well. And the rivalry really starts to develop over this, doesn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it's interesting to see the kind of the way the attendance figures develop in Berlin, because effectively what happens is that BFC Dynamo were founded at the same time as Union, and they're always a bigger and more favoured club than Union from that point on within Berlin, but they're not actually the big dogs in East German football at large until the late 70s. That's when their dominance really starts kicking off. And if you look at the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, Union's attendance figures tend to be higher. You can really see, okay, more people are drawn to this civilian club, this people's club, than they are to this kind of obviously very, very Stasi affiliated, very, very police affiliated construct. And then BFC start to win everything, and then the attendance figures just about cross, and BFC start getting higher attendance figures in the 80s, or at least it starts evening out. And I think that's also worth remembering, is that particularly in the 80s, BFC were the biggest team. They were the Bayern Munich, the Juventus, the Manchester United, and that meant that basically the mass of their supporters were ordinary football fans who just wanted to go and see the best team. And there are a lot of people who don't go to BFC now, wouldn't shout from the rooftops, I'm a BFC fan, but they were going to BFC every week in the 80s, and that's fine. That's normal. That happens in every country as well. That there are generations of success, and then you get a lot of fans, and that will probably happen to Union once they finally fall off the cliff. But the rivalry, I think, is much more about those hardcore groups of fans who would have been there from the early 60s and 70s onwards, and for whom I think that kind of those identities, that People's Club and Stasi Club, if you like, they articulated them in opposition to each other, and BFC fans did that, as readily as Union fans did that. There was no shyness there. They really embraced, to a large extent, particularly in the 80s, the kind of idea that we've got the Stasi, we're the elite. Even though to a large extent they were also being pursued by the Stasi in the same way, because the Stasi had no interest in having hooligans of any stripe. I mean, there's certain anecdotes about individual BFC hooligans getting off, lighter because their dad was a high-ranking Stasi officer or whatever. But broadly speaking, it wasn't like the Stasi were happy to see, Nazi skinheads running around any stadium. But it's interesting that even the far right stuff of BFC, there's the famous song about that they used to sing about my grandfather's in the SS, my dad's in the Stasi, and I go to BFC. Like the kind of mental gymnastics that you have to do to celebrate your granddad being a Nazi, your dad being a communist agent, and you being a football hooligan is baffling. But they did that. That was the part of it, and the absurdity of it was also almost part of the kind of thrill of it, I guess, for that part. And Union's fan scene, the continuous thing in Union's fan scene over that 30 years is very much the antipathy towards BFC and by extension authority and the general system. And I think that was, without BFC, Union would not have the fan culture they have because they had something to kick against and a lot of the time be beaten up by and feel aggrieved. And when you've got that, then you have a stronger identity than if you're Stahl Brandenburg or whoever just out in the woods and playing football.
Yeah, and I think it's, kind of on the footballing side of things as well, it would be quite frustrating from an Union perspective if you're a fan, because, as was the case with many clubs who came from the Stasi or the police or the military, quite often they would have the most resources put into them, as you'd mentioned. But in the case of a lot of clubs, I don't know if this happened in East Germany, but certainly in Albania, Phil Harrison's releasing a book on football in Albania now, and stories from Stalinist Albania in particular, which is going to be really interesting. But it's like, you had the clubs there who came from the military, who players would just get moved to the teams preferred to by authorities and things like that. And I can imagine there's probably a lot of that happening as well within the DDR, and you've got these things where players are just being shifted, transfer fees are being paid, money's just being pumped into them, and it's not going to your club. So there is going to be that frustration, and it's the view that they're the authority club as well. But of course, they had other rivalries as well. Dynamo Dresden, there was a bit of animosity there. Hansa, who doesn't have a rivalry with Hansa? It seems like everyone in the Gran has a rivalry with Hansa at this stage. And of course, and another important one, the rivalry that would end up happening with Hertha as well. But of course, to us, we need to remember, and I mean, certainly for myself anyway, and people of my generation, we didn't live to see the Berlin Wall, or, well, we weren't alive when it was taken down. But, you need to imagine that there is very much this hard border between you and this club less than a mile away, maybe not even. You're not able to cross that border or go through it. If you do, you're either going to be arrested or you're going to be killed. You're not able to have that rivalry with them, and it developed in a bit differently than it did with the rivalry with Dynamo, because it ended up becoming a bit friendlier and a bit of a kind of, we're sort of distant cousins almost, and we meet up and we play these games, but actually what we want is to be able to join you in the same league, in the same division.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that, again, as I said, this idea of BFC and their dominance and their kind of privileges being a massive part of Union's identity also plays into that. I mean, the famous chant with the Hertha Union thing that was sung in both stadiums on either side of the wall was Nur zwei Meister an der Spree, Union and Hertha BSC, and that's only two champions on the Spree, the river in Berlin, Union and Hertha. And that's a direct jibe at BFC, because they were winning title after title after title in Berlin, in East Germany. But it's suggesting that their titles are illegitimate, and only Union and Hertha would be legitimate champions if they won a title. And I think that, I mean, that's an interesting relationship, because that's another thing that gets, to a certain extent, played up a little bit, because there's, it's a lot of, subjectively, it's a big part of certain fans' narratives about their identity as Union fans. So Union fans obviously couldn't go to the West, but Hertha fans could come to the East. That was possible, and so they did occasionally, and there was contact in that respect. Also, when Hertha played games in the Eastern Bloc, Union fans would often go and be with the Hertha fans in Prague or wherever it was. That was quite a common thing. And I think also it was worth pointing out that most East German fans had a West German club as well. That was quite an ordinary, there were quite a lot of fan friendships in that way that Chemie and Eintracht Frankfurt, for example, and Leipzig, count as an individual people saying, okay, I'm a Bayern fan as well as a, Hansa Rostock fan or whatever. So that was quite a normal thing, the idea that there would be some kind of sympathy. And I think it became part of the mythology of Union as rebel club that okay, if you were wearing a Hertha badge on your denim jacket when you went into the stadium, then the authorities would tell you to take it off. So it becomes then a point of pride to wear as many as you can and to smuggle them in, and that kind of feeds this thing of, okay, Hertha and Union together, and the fan friendships having some kind of bond. It's complicated slightly in that it was also something that I think was, be careful how I word it, but was not. It overlaps a little bit with some of the far right elements in both those fan bases at certain times, and it's not a direct and constant link, but it's that's in that mix as well, if you like, which I think is perhaps also part of the reason why it fades quite quickly after the war, because when the war comes down, a few months later, there's this big kind of symbolic friendly match between Union and Hertha in the Olympiastadion, and all the fans are coming together, and a couple of BFC hooligans try and get in at one point, and everyone chases them out, and it's this wonderful, fantastic friendship. Berlin and Germany coming back together, and Hertha and Union finally brought back under one banner, even though they were never under one banner in the first place. But there's this idea of, okay, we're long lost cousins and we're together again. And then it kind of fades, and some Union fans start going to Hertha and just keep on going to Hertha. Some go to Hertha for a little bit and then just go, it's not really for me, and drift back to Union. A lot of people give up on football entirely because there's just a lot of violence going on, and neither club does particularly well in those few years after the war comes down. And that whole friendship thing kind of breaks down without the thing to kick against, without the thing to say, okay, we're against this BFC, this division, this oppression, there's these obvious kind of hard things in our life. It just kind of fades away, and then it's only and it remains, well, for 20 years you have a kind of big brother little brother relationship where neither group particularly cares about the other too much, and there's not really a fan friendship, but there's also no particular antipathy. And it's only really in the end of the 2000s, beginning of the 2010s, when suddenly it becomes more common that they're in the same division, and you'll get back into the second division, and they start and have to go down. That's 2010-11, I think, that first season, and you'll beat them in the Olympiastadion. At that point, suddenly it's clear these are the two biggest teams in Berlin. One's from the east, one's from the west. There's a whole new generation of fans who had nothing to do with this friendship. They hate each other, and by the time 2019 comes around and Union are in the Bundesliga, I mean, even that game, I mean, the first derby, November 2019, I remember going to it and sort of talking to people and saying, this is kind of interesting because depending on how tonight goes, it could really, really set the tone for the next decade of this kind of relationship between the two clubs. And that was a last minute 1-0 win from a penalty by Union, in which rockets were fired onto the pitch, and Union fans tried to like invade the Hertha block. So it set a pretty grim tone, and there's not much love lost now between. But you speak to the older guys, and a lot of them don't feel it, and they're quite happy now that Hertha, albeit they're in the second division, the kind of politics of the club now is improving from a fan perspective, and a lot of Union fans say, "Oh, great! It's really good to see that happening at Hertha." So it's a strange relationship, and as I say, I think it initially founded on this Union's identity as rebel club in inverted commas, and then once that kind of went, it all goes melts down a little bit.
What I find really interesting, and something that I took from the book as well, is that you can almost look at these generational issues, if you like, within the Union fan base through the Berlin derby. You can look at it through the different sort of derbies that they've had, because there's the derby during the DDR, if you like. There's a derby once the wall falls to an extent, and then there's the derby when Union are back in the Bundesliga, and it's really, really, really fascinating. It's a really, really great case study for looking at all of these different sort of heritage concepts and issues through football, because there's just so many to discuss as well. And I think that leads us quite nicely onto the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of football in the DDR, and things begin to get merged. But during this period of time, Union aren't having the best period of their existence. In fact, they almost go bankrupt at one point, don't they? And they almost fall out of existence completely.
Yeah, several times. They spend the 90s almost going bankrupt and falling out of existence completely. In fact, pretty much until 2004. But yeah, I mean, it's a classic story. I mean, again, the chapter on the book about that kind of period, I speak to the club historian because he's an interesting guy from that perspective, partly because he's quite good at busting the myths, which I think is important in that period because there's a lot of, it's contested the extent to which, East Germany is exploited or disadvantaged by the way reunification happens, and it's important. It was important to have somebody who is a historian in that sense and was very invested in giving an objective view. But I mean, he's interesting as well. His personal story. I mean, he was, I guess, in his early 20s when the wall came down, and that's always an interesting thing in East Germany. How old were you when it happens? That has a big kind of impact on what it means for you if you're mid-career in a profession which is not going to exist once communism is gone. Then that's a much more horrible and destructive experience for the wall to come down and that state to disappear than it is for somebody who's 15 and maybe has much more opportunity under capitalism than they would have done under communism. So it's always a very contested period. And I think one of the points he made was there was a lot of optimism and a lot of, particularly I think for smaller clubs like Union or Chemie Leipzig who have been disadvantaged by this communist system, that they kind of thought, okay, now we're going to get into this free state, this free capitalist model, and we're going to have equal chances. And we're going to be able to break free of these chains, and we're going to be able to kind of build something up and become a big club because we've got a big fan base. So why not? Why can't we be like Kaiserslautern or Werder Bremen or whoever? What happens then is that most of the East German players go west because that's where the money is, which is a reflection of quite a lot of what happened with the East German economy. There's a brain drain. A lot of West German companies are allowed to come in and effectively do the privatization themselves. There's high unemployment. And also the structures, the people you need to, and this was the point the historian was making, the people you need to succeed in a capitalist model, the people in the positions of leadership, are very, very different to the people you might need in a communist model. And a lot of these clubs, Union were a pretty well-run club, albeit they were disadvantaged in the GDR. But to be a well-run club in the GDR, that meant having good party contacts. That meant knowing how to play the party system a little bit. That meant, knowing how to talk to the right people in the right way, with the right euphemisms at the right time. That's a very, very different thing to doing that in a free market capitalist, quite, cutthroat business world of post-war Berlin. And then you have a lot of East German clubs, both either the East German club being mismanaged by people who would have managed them well under communism, or those people saying, okay, we need external help, and basically falling prey to a lot of very, very shady characters who come in from the West promising the earth and effectively delivering very little or stripping the club for various assets. Union had a similar story. I won't get into the details. It's far too complicated, but effectively they plummet initially. They don't make it into the initial promotion to the Bundesliga in the second division, which would have been the professional structure. So they plummet. Then they get that far, but their promotion is null and void a few days later because it turns out that they forged their legal license. Basically, they forged they've cooked the books and made it out that they've got a bank guarantee that they haven't got. That's interesting from a derby perspective as well, because supposedly the person who tipped off the authorities was Jack White, the president of Tennis Borussia, and that was a kind of big bone of contention between Tennis Borussia and Union at that time, who were much more likely to play each other than Hertha and Union. So that was for a brief period in the mid-90s a much bigger derby for Union, this other West Berlin club that are now in the 5th division. And history could have taken a very different turn. And they struggle through. They're a big enough club. They've got a big enough fan base that there's always somebody saying, "Okay, I'm going to come in and make Union the next big thing," but they're never quite big enough to really make it work, and they very often fall prey to these situations. And then it's only really in the late 90s and the early 2000s that effectively, after a few near bankruptcies, the fans realize, well, look, quite often we've had this situation where we've had to bail the club out. We've done a whip round. We've started these collections or donated to get the club over the line in various near bankruptcy situations. We can run the club effectively, and that culture kind of develops over 6 or 7 years to the point where in 2004 suddenly you get a change of power at the top, and you get Dirk Zingler. I mean, it's not a total grassroots revolution, from the terraces, but Zingler is a lifelong Union fan. He's effectively coming with a cohort of lifelong Union fans who are also reasonably successful businessmen and business people in East Berlin and in the region, and effectively comes in and starts to kind of clean the club up, and that's the start of the sort of big rise to where they are today. And I think that's the pride for a lot of Union fans, that they say, look, we didn't get what we expected from reunification, like a lot of East German clubs, the kind of sunlit uplands, if you like, to borrow a phrase of modern British parlance, didn't come. And we were betrayed by that, but then we picked ourselves up. It was us fans who saved the club from bankruptcy. It was us fans who effectively kept it alive and then cleaned it up and put the right people in power who then did that. And that kind of drive came from within the community, at least, and within the region. And I think that's a huge point of pride, because most other East German clubs haven't managed to do that yet. Some are on a little bit of a better way now, but most other East German clubs are still struggling with those problems and the legacy of those problems 30 years on. And you look at Lok Leipzig, Chemie Leipzig, even clubs like Dynamo Dresden, Hansa Rostock, Energie Cottbus, who had brief periods up in the Bundesliga, they've also struggled with those issues and are not as big as perhaps they could be now.
Yeah, again, there's so many elements at play here, and I think it's really important that we touch on all of them, because at this point you're really adding this next layer of Union's identity to it through the fans who went and saved the club. And you're right that it's a massive source of pride for them, because they did save the club, but it wasn't just a case of they chipped in to save it. They were out painting seats in the stadium. They were out, cleaning the gutters around the ground. They were out picking litter, and all these little things that people don't really see. It was a huge community effort, and I think it was how Union effectively rooted themselves within the community and really kind of gave them this anchor to drive things forward. But from what you said at the beginning as well, just to touch on it, not really getting what they wanted from reunification. You touched on it in your book as well, that the best players would get picked up by Western clubs because they already had the financial resources to do that. A lot of the Eastern German clubs just got left behind in that regard. They struggled to catch up to them in divisions. They fell further and further down the tiers, to the point now where you're really talking about Union and the other club from Leipzig, who I really dislike, who are probably the most successful East German football teams now, with the exception of a couple other historic examples. But it is a bit of a shame, and it's a huge source of frustration for a lot of East German fans or fans from the former East, because they were promised one thing, but we all know how capitalism operates. It rolls in, it takes, it gives very, very little back in a lot of cases, and that's exactly what's happened. But Union thankfully did not fall out of existence. Their fans clubbed together to help them and get them now back to where they think they deserve they should be. But not all clubs from the former East can say the same, because it's just one of these things that unfortunately was a really, really horrible byproduct of reunification, that so many clubs effectively just had to dissolve because the resources were gone almost overnight, and they never really came back. But now you have this generation of Union fans who, they know the club's rooted in the community. They obviously have a huge stake in owning the club and have a massive say in what the club does and where it goes. And there have been clashes more in the modern era, but at this point in time, really the 90s into the 2000s, it's this great thing where Union is really the community club, and a brilliant example for a lot of other clubs to follow.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess it's sort of worth pointing out that this kind of does happen at other clubs too in the East. There's a fan base there that you look at clubs like, Lok Leipzig are a good example. They were the biggest club in Leipzig. They were the sort of BFC Dynamo of Leipzig, if you like. They kind of had more of the favourable conditions than Chemie, who were the smaller club. And then the wall comes down, and they've got a lot of optimism, partly because they're the successor club of VfB Leipzig, who were the first ever German champions and were founders of the German Football Association, which they are now back part of because they're in reunified Germany. And so they rebrand as VfB Leipzig, which in many ways is a really clever thing to do, and a really, at the time, really welcome. It's saying, okay, we're going to cast off this East German era, which none of us like, and we're going to go back to our roots, to our heritage, to our history and traditions of VfB, the first ever German champions. But once that construct falls down, which it does, they get into the Bundesliga, and then this cycle, as you say, of it not really working under capitalism. once that construct falls down, the trust is broken, and there's a lot of people left going, hang on, I'm left with a bankrupt club which doesn't have the same name that it had when I was a kid. And the fans then say, okay, no, this club has gone bankrupt, it's gone dissolved. We're going to create the Phoenix Club, and we're going to create it under the name of Lok Leipzig, the East German, and this is in the early 2000s, the East German name. And so there's this back and forth between these two names. Do you go for the original name that then is, taken back on with huge gusto and excitement in the early 90s, or do you go for the East German name? And in the end, it's a similar thing almost that happens at Lok, that the fans come together and say, no, this is our club, and we're going to say, no, this is what we grew up with. This is Lok. We're doing it ourselves. We're not getting some sunlit up plans of reunification or Western idea of what our club should be. We're saying this is what we've always had. And that's kind of the same thought as Union fans saying, we're just going to do it our way. We're going to build our own stadium. We're going to donate our blood. We're going to do all these things. And that's a very common thing in East German football. The difference with Union is that, well, in many ways they've got the perfect environment, because Berlin is Berlin. It's the biggest city. You can get a lot more hipsters in. You can get a lot more people excited. It's probably the only East German city that hasn't been underpopulated for the 20 years after the wall comes down. There's more money in Berlin, particularly from the mid 2000s on. All these different things, and then you've got this maybe slightly stronger identity that's had a bit more continuity. You haven't gone back and forth with your identities when the wall comes down. You've done all these things. A lot of things come together there which provide this basis, and Union absolutely, I think, provide my point where I'm going with this is that Union absolutely provide a counter model, an alternative model for, say, a Western fan looking in and saying, how can we take our club's identity as fans and our fan base's identity and create something that we can all be on board with, both club and fan base. Union have built something healthy in that regard. I'm not sure to what extent they're a genuinely a model for other East German clubs, because I think that would be to do a slight disservice to the fan groups of those East German clubs who have tried a lot of the time. They have done a lot, but a lot of other factors come together and make it very difficult. So yeah, it's an interesting. They're almost in their kind of unique space on Union, and I think that's part of their story as well. That they pulled it back from the brink. They pulled it together, almost creating this kind of new sense of East Berlin identity, or channeling it at least through the kind of new Union, and they're very proud of that, and have managed to build something which is pretty unique. There is no, as you say, no other club that's managed to do that. The only others who have got higher, Hansa, Dynamo, Energie, but that's a long time ago now, and none of them for very long. And then RB Leipzig, who are the classic post-reunification East German story, where the only way you can get success is if you get a big Western company to come in and say, you can have success, but we're going to plaster our logo all over it. And there are a lot of people in Leipzig who say that's a fair price to pay. I'd rather have a Champions League football club playing great football and that I can go and watch, without being rained on and without having violence on the terraces, and a higher level of football. And to a certain extent, that's fair enough as well. That's I also don't have much love for that club, but there's a reason why they exist. There is a base there. There are people who are calling out for something like that. And yeah, I think Union the Union story of a successful ground up grassroots from the community East German club is entirely unique, and it's bucked a lot of narratives and kind of trends about East Germany, and I think that's fascinating. I had an interview with there's just been a new film made about them in Germany. It's just come out this week, and the director is a very successful East German film director, and she grew up quite near the stadium, and I did an interview with her the other week, and she said, the reason I wanted to go and do a film about Union is because I wanted to do a film where you see East Germans getting something right. You see an East German project going well, and that's, there isn't one. We look anywhere else, even outside of football, even in, you can take people like Angela Merkel as East German, but she doesn't really talk about her East German identity because, it's potentially toxic. It's potentially divisive to raise that and to kind of stylize herself around that. So she was always very careful with it. That's true of other people in the public eye as well. And Union are pretty much the only kind of major popular culture mainstream success story that is proudly East German in inverted commas. That's a slightly problematic term, but effectively openly and proud to say, no, this is where we're from and this is what we've done. And that's particularly in the context of Germany today, a very, very interesting and unique story.
Yeah, and I think this idea of there always being a kind of Western saviour, if you like, is quite important as well, because even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, though it was, a huge joyous occasion, huge victory for a lot of people, and there was hope that, they were able to move around freely now. In the years that followed, there was still a lot of caution, still a lot of wariness, and a lot of West Berliners, I say a lot, this, I'm talking to someone who is not from or has been to Berlin, unfortunately, but they look down their noses at a lot of people from East Germany as well. And, there's always been this kind of issue that's sort of grown and grown over the years. And again, as generations go on, that will change and become a different point of contention as well. But there's always been this sort of underlying theme where there's been a East versus a West, or a former East versus a West. And as you said, it is still problematic though, and there is still people trying to unify under that. But now you've got places in the former East which are being gentrified pretty heavily, and there's this kind of new era of capitalist development that's rolling in as well, and it all provides this really, really fascinating context to football in the former East and the former West as well, and the different things that the people engage with and that they say to each other, and how they engage with each other as well.
Yeah, I think again that's probably why Union is so interesting, because I think it's always worth being careful with that East-West narrative, because I mean the sort of classic delineation of it is this Besser Wessi and Yammer Ossi, which are the kind of slang words after the wall came down, and it's sort of know-it-all Westerner and the moaning Easterner, and that those two kind of archetypes, if you like, are still, people don't call each other that, but they're still they still inform to a large extent the debates and the kind of frictions that exist now. And I think basically the nub of it is that they're talking at cross purposes the whole time. A lot of people in the West are saying, well, look, you can't just always be bad in East Germany, and actually there's been a lot of investment, and you can't say, oh, it's terrible, our economy, and then say investment is bad because it's come from the West. That's no answer. You can't just kind of build this East German identity and shut yourself off from the rest of the world. And people in the East are saying, yeah, but this wasn't what we signed up for. We were told it was going to be sunlit uplands, and we end up having 10 years of mass unemployment and economic crisis. And so there's this, in many ways, both of them are right. Both those stories are true. They're not kind of, it's an almost impossible situation to try and merge effectively a failed economy into a successful one overnight, which is what they had to do in 1990. So all those frictions are built into it. And I think in many ways, the only way out of that kind of vicious circle or problem, if you like, is to build something positive that's East German and that is also open, and to say, okay, we are East German, these are our roots, this is Union, we have these roots in the DDR and being against BFC and having this rebel spirit, but we're also who we are now, and that's up for anyone who's here now to decide, and collectively with the older generation and the younger generation, and we're building this success not for to romanticize some idealized version of a East German past, but to say, no, we as East Germans are building something here in East Germany now, and that's something which doesn't happen on either side, and which there hasn't really been much space for on either side of the debate for a long time, I think, and I think which a lot of people have been yearning for. And I think that's what a lot of people look at Union and they think, this is interesting. This is something that can potentially break out. And there are people in the West who say, and people in the East who say, Union go too far with the whole East German thing, and they paint themselves as East German, and it's problematic. But there are also people who look at it and say, no, this is just a success story, and they're proud of where they're from, and that's a much more positive narrative than saying we're proud to be the victims of reunification. That's very much not the narrative of Union. We were the victims. It's no, we're just going to go ahead and do it, roll up our sleeves and make something good out of it. And I think a lot of people are attracted to that narrative, and I think to a large extent it is successful. And it's interesting that you mentioned the gentrification of certain parts of East Berlin. I mean, that's part of the Union story for sure, and the gentrification of the terraces at Union is a ongoing struggle and phenomenon that people are kind of trying to find their answer to. And yeah, there will always be losers in those processes, and there will always be people who say, we should kind of shut ourselves off a little bit more and not just allow anybody to come in and say I'm an Unioner or whatever because I live in Friedrichshain because I pay 5 times the rent that somebody who lived there 5 years ago pays, because I just fresh off the boat from London or New York. That's a real tension that exists in East Berlin and in Berlin generally and at Union. But at the same time, you look at Köpenick, the area around Union, which is slightly further out from the city centre, and that's being gentrified in inverted commas as well. But that's a really good thing. There's a lot of investment, there's a lot of money pouring into that region, which people who have been there for 50 years are also profiting from, and are also thinking these are the fat years. These are this is the golden age of living here. And so there's always those two sides. I think particularly in areas like East Germany and East Berlin, where investment brings gentrification, investment brings influence from people who are investing, investment brings new challenges and new tensions, but it also gets rid of some of the old ones. And Union are trying to straddle that paradox at the moment, if you like.
Exactly. It's about striking a balance, and it's about striking the right balance. You're never going to make anyone happy, and I think that should be said, is that not everyone is going to like this or enjoy it, but if you can do it properly, then it can be something that's really good. And as you mentioned, gentrification of a football club or on the terraces is completely different to the gentrification of an area where there's investment coming in and new enterprises and new commercial opportunities and things popping up. Obviously, it does mean that a lot of people end up getting priced out and having to move. And it's about a balance. It's about making sure that those people in your core demographic are still able to enjoy the football club and come and see them as well. But again, this moves us quite nicely into the modern era, where there's another new generation of Union supporters, and I suppose more within the last kind of 5 years to a decade or so, you have this generation who a lot of the older fan base would regard as either tourist fans or hipster fans, or people who are just coming to the ground because they're successful. And with them getting to the Bundesliga, it's really kind of heightened that tension and really brought it out quite a bit, because tickets for Union now are like gold dust.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because it's changing all the time. I mean, I tend to think that they're doing all right at the moment with that problem. I mean, this was even before they got promoted. This was the big question was at the moment in 2017, let's say, when they first start challenging for promotion, you've got a 22,000 stadium, you're getting crowds of 21,000 every week. That's almost perfect. You can get as many tickets as you like. If you're an Union fan, you're seeing the best football you've ever seen. If you're an Union fan, pretty much, you're playing against clubs like 1860 Munich, St. Pauli, whatever, Hamburg, who, big fun games to go to, lots of fun away games. This is the golden age, and that was why the book is called Scheisse, We're Going Up. It was why Union fans at the time, when they got close to promotion, held up this banner saying Scheisse, We're Going Up, because it was an expression of that was actually, we're fine here. We don't really want to get into this Alice in Wonderland, Pandora's box of the Bundesliga and success, because of what it brings. And one of the concerns of what it would bring is, suddenly being the hot ticket, and everybody who every second hipster in Berlin being like, okay, I'm going to go down there and have a look at it and get a ticket and become a member. And that's what's happened. The club had 18,000 members, I think, before promotion. They now have 65,000 members with a 22,000 capacity stadium. That means that people aren't getting in, that who would otherwise have got in every week. That means that groups who went to watch the games together even 5 years ago aren't going every week as full groups. And so far, and that's what I mean, I think it has been well managed because of the nature of the Union fan base. It sort of organizes itself, and there are always ways of getting tickets through a mate or whatever that mean that nobody is really, really disadvantaged at the moment. It's just a bit more difficult to get hold of tickets, and it's a bit more of a faff than it was. The atmosphere is not markedly different than it was 5 years ago. If anything, it's better because there's been so much success. And I think the constant struggle is maintaining that balance, and that gets harder and harder with every passing year and with more and more success you have. And so far, the answer to that has been to say, okay, look, the key thing is that we and both from the club side and the sort of more organically from the fan base, we almost immunize the new fans against being the kind of new fans we don't want, in the sense that we I spoke to someone in the book who said, the good thing about Union is that we're evangelical. We think we have the best atmosphere and the greatest football club and the greatest stadium in the world and the best fan culture. And so if you come, we will tell you about it, and we will tell you how it works, and we will say, you need to do this, this, and this, and this, and this. And, you don't just come and have a little look, and you have to sing, you have to stand with us, you have to be fine when you get beer poured all over your head. You have to, this is all part of the thing that you're signing up for. You don't leave before the final whistle. You never leave before the final whistle. You never boo your own players. You never, all these golden rules that there are in the sort of Union fan culture. So far, I think that balance has worked reasonably well, and there isn't too much tension really between, you get the odds. New fan comes up, is looking for a space on the terraces, and old fan goes, you can't stand here. That's normal. That's been the case for decades. But beyond that, there isn't too much kind of us and them, at least in that dynamic. But it will get harder and harder. And I think that, if you think about the way a terrace works, a standing terrace, it's a different dynamic to a seated stadium where if you've bought a ticket, you've bought your seat, and someone can tell you don't sit in that seat. I'm sitting in that seat, but you can probably go to a steward and say, I've got this ticket for this seat, and they'll come and sort you out. At Union, you've got 3 stands that are the standing terraces. That's in many ways trickier if you're a newcomer to navigate and to know, okay, should I stand here or should I not stand here? But in many ways, it's better, it's healthier, because it allows people to organize in a certain way, and it allows people to say, look, if you just move up a little bit and let this guy in because he's been coming for 40 years, then, and he always stands here, then, okay, I'll move to the left or whatever. And that kind of things iron themselves out. But it is getting harder. And, even within this season, it's got harder to get hold of tickets. People are not going to games which they would have gone to even last season because it would have been easier to get hold of a ticket. And maintaining that balance and maintaining that kind of, I guess balance is the only word in the ecosystem where it is open and it is, welcoming to new fans, but it's also retaining and maintaining its kind of own spirit and its traditions is a massive issue. And I think, they're hoping to expand the stadium to 40,000 in the next few years. We'll see how quickly they manage to do it. Every year they don't manage to do it, the tension rises a little bit. And even when they do, that's a big thing as well, because suddenly the dynamic of the stadium changes. Up until now, part of the special thing about Union is that you've had these 3 standing sides. Pretty much half of the stadium is the same thing you would have directly behind the goal at any other stadium in the world. It's a wall of noise of hardcore fans going for it for 90 minutes. Once you have a 40,000 stadium, that's a slightly different dynamic. Either they're all behind the goal or they're spread out a little bit more, and you've got, it'll still be mostly standing around most of the stadium, but they'll have a bit more seated areas. It'll be a lot more families, a lot more day trippers coming in. The atmosphere will be different. It'll be more like, say, Dortmund now or St. Pauli now, where it can be fantastic. It can be really loud, but it's not always. And certain parts of the ground tend to be quiet and things like that, which is fine. That's part of the development of it. But, there will be people then who go, it's better before. And so, all these questions sort of come together, and I think that the good thing about Union is that conversation is live. The people have been having it since 2017, if not much longer. And it's not like they're kind of, even though the success has been so quick and so meteoric, it's not like they've been kind of caught short by it. They've been ready to have these conversations and to draw their red lines in the sand and to kind of say what they're up for and what they're not up for. And it's ongoing. It's a process that everyone's kind of feeling their way through, but people are active and aware of it. And I think that does come across to new fans. And the message for anybody who goes to Union is basically don't buy a ticket for €200 on Viagogo. If you're in the stadium, by all means go. Don't feel guilty for going and taking a ticket from somebody else, but respect those things. Don't leave before the final whistle. Don't beat your own team. Don't, just stand quietly. Don't moan if someone throws beer on you, that kind of thing. It's integration is a two-way process. That's the...
Yeah, you're spot on. This is the thing. Obviously, a lot of the questions that I've been asking you have been a little bit devil's advocate at some points, but it's to draw out all these things that actually Union have been doing really, really well to strike that balance. And the thing is, and I've not really seen it with a lot of football clubs in the UK. One or two come to mind, maybe Motherwell, possibly a couple of other teams in England. But as you said, the conversation is live, and it's not just with the stadium capacity. It's not just with new fans coming in. It's with any issue that could possibly come up, is that Union have a conversation with the fans about it. They have the capacity and resources and facilities to be able to do that with the fan base. And I think that's the most important thing, is that there's always an open dialogue. There's always communication, and they're always working towards solving the problem. with the fans. And I think that's the most important thing about it, is that they're able to do that so that they can work towards it. Yes, it's going to be sad when the stadium is eventually developed because it's going to lose a part of it, but unfortunately that's just part of the development and part of the progression. And the one thing that's been on my mind through our conversation with new fans coming in and tickets becoming a little more scarce is it's just growth. This is what happens when your football club grows at the end of the day. And yes, you're in the Bundesliga. The fans who have been there when the club was much lower down the tier are probably having the time of their lives, and you'd like to think anyway. But there's going to come a time where they're going to become a staple Bundesliga club, probably, and the dynamic is going to change. But that's unfortunately just what they're going to have to put up with, and it is just one of the sad facts of football and your football club getting a bit bigger, I think. But the important thing is that the conversation is there and that they're always in dialogue with the fans, and that's really part of what makes them who they are. It's part of them what gives them this identity. And again, comes back to what we said at the start of the episode, that the stadium and the club is a space for the fans. It's a safe space. It's a space where they can communicate with each other and talk to each other through the issues. And I think that's something that's really special and really unique at the moment, you know, kind of within modern football.
Yeah, and I think, as I say, I think this next 5 year period is going to be really interesting in that regard, because as you say, they are now in the phase. You know, the last 5 years, it's kind of been the honeymoon period. The pandemic has also kind of warped it a little bit, in the sense that everybody, whenever they've been in the stadium, they've just been so happy to be there, and all those kind of issues and tensions have kind of been secondary anyway, because the team have been doing so well. You know, no longer the stadium is closed just after the pandemic, etc., etc. And now we're entering that phase of, okay, 5th year in the Bundesliga, it's going to be a lower mid-table finish this year. It's not going to be as special. This is where, you got to 65,000 members. The dynamic generally within the organization, just as a members club, is changing a little bit and becoming a little bit more kind of, as you say, normal mid-sized to slightly larger Bundesliga club. That how they develop that over the next 5 years, particularly with the stadium expansion, is going to be really key, because so far they've been doing it really well, but it only takes a couple of years of taking your eye off the ball and suddenly you've lost something quite valuable.
Precisely. I mean, just before we finish things up, the last thing that I wanted to ask you was, how do you think that Union can preserve their heritage and identity? Maybe it's not so much the fans, but how the club can do that and work towards, one, promoting, and two, protecting it, the physical elements and the intangibles through their Bundesliga journey, if you like, because we don't know when it's going to come to an end at the moment. Hopefully not very soon, but how do you think they go about protecting and promoting that?
Yeah, it's tricky, partly because it's a club, it's not like St. Pauli, where there's a very clear identity and a clear set of values that everyone kind of gets on board with. Union is much more foggy, and people project lots of different things onto it, depending on, as we were saying, depending on generations and depending on what angle they're coming to it from. So it's very hard for the club to say, okay, this is who we are and this is what we do. And the thing they latch onto always is this idea of pure football. So this idea of the stadium experience being sacrosanct and not having an excessive advertising during the game, not having throw-ins sponsored by, the local insurance company or whatever, and things like that, and keeping the kind of match day liturgy quite sparse and quite much like it has been for the last 20, 30 years. I'm not sure the club can do that much more than that, to be honest. I think the club are always going to be caught in the paradoxes and the traps of modern commercial football. You see it now. There are things happening now. Tomorrow they're going to be playing with a Star Trek logo on their shirts because the current shirt sponsor is Paramount Plus, and they want to advertise their Star Trek. That sort of thing. 5 years ago, that would have caused an absolute uproar. People have been saying this is an absolute disgrace that they're using our club to do this. Now people are like, yeah, okay, if we're going to be competing at this level, then we need a sponsor who is going to ask for that kind of thing, and maybe it's better it's that than a betting company or a local development company who are pushing people out, pricing people out of their homes, so which they've had in the past. People's kind of red lines shift as well, I think, and the club are kind of, all the club can do is try and manage that process slowly and steadily. It's not always in complete conversation with the fans, because the way the club is run is relatively we're doing this, and you guys have got to make your peace with it. It's not like every decision is put to a referendum or anything like that. There's a powerful president, and he tends to say what's what. But people trust him. People trust, because of who he is and where he's come from and his background. Most Union fans, even if they disagree with a single decision and have a argument with him on that, they trust the general direction. And I think they're, broadly speaking, right to, because I think he's proven over 15, 20 years that he's able to grow this club without, selling its identity down the river. And he's not interested in doing that. He's doing it because he is obsessed with this club, not because he's making loads and loads of money out of it. And I think that people are reasonably happy with that thing. But in terms of the identity, I actually think it is more about the fans. And I think it's really interesting the different ways in which that develops. And it was interesting to see in the European campaigns that a lot of the kind of pageantry of the fan culture at that time was deliberately harking back to certain kind of motifs and things to do with the DDR and the East German history. So, for example, the Union fans had this huge banner with a kind of stylized plane and the word Reisekarte, which it's hard to translate because it literally means travel squad, but it was effectively what GDR diplomats or official delegations of the GDR would have been referred to in official documents if they went abroad. And that, so it's an irony, and it's an irony that you kind of, it's a very, very East German joke, if that makes sense. And even making it so boldly as a statement of East German identity, it's saying this is where we're from, this is who we are, and the fact that we're in Madrid now, the fact that we're in Braga now or Napoli now is wild, because we're Union and we're from this background. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because it's quite subtle and it's quite kind of, it's not exclusionary and it's not a massive victim narrative, and it's not a lot of the things which people have problems with East German identity, but it is saying, no, this is who we are, and we're kind of keen to maintain that. And I think that kind of tone is the sort of thing that the Union fan base can do, which the club have to be a little bit more careful about, I think. They do it to a certain extent, but it's always a little bit more controversial when they do it. And I think the fan base have a big role in that, in kind of all that, stuff like pageantry, stuff like choreos, tifos, stuff like stickers, stuff like certain chants, and there's a huge thing at the moment in the Union Ultras. There's a concerted effort to bring back certain chants that have kind of gone out of fashion in the last 10 or 15 years. Certain ones that were there in East Germany era or there in the 90s, and that's a really interesting process as well, because occasionally there's one where half the stadium goes, not sure if we should be singing that anymore. Occasionally there's one where people go, oh, fantastic, I haven't sung this in 20 years and amazing, and what an amazing song. And then they're telling the younger generation, oh, we used to sing this and this is what it means. And that, I think all that it's organic, and it's not necessarily always pretty, and it's not necessarily always clean, but that's part of the maintaining the identity. And I think that's really important. I think there is a very kind of concerted effort in the fan base to kind of do that in a way that's not too didactic and not too, this is how you should be as an Unioner. There are a few rules, like the not going for the final whistle, etc. But beyond that, it's quite organic and quite kind of, nice. I guess it's a nice tone, and it is what it is. It's unique, and it's not for everyone, but it's I think they're pretty good at maintaining their identity and heritage. I think that's something that this fan base has learned to do very well.
Yeah, it's kind of coming full circle back to where we started. There's these things that you've mentioned, words that you've used, subtle, for instance, safe space, bohemian, unique. And I think that's exactly what it is. It's just it's a chill atmosphere, it's a party atmosphere, it's inclusionary. It's one where people can go along and can enjoy. And I think that's what makes it so important, is that they're inviting you in to share what their identity is without you necessarily having the same heritage as them or coming from the same background as them. And I think that's very, very important in football, and particularly within ultras culture as well. I mean, I'm going to be really kind of fascinated to see what happens with Union over the next few years within the Bundesliga and otherwise. But I'd be inclined to agree with you that I think they're pretty good at having these conversations and preserving their heritage and identity when the questions arise, and it's not something that you get an awful lot of in football these days. Where physical heritage is concerned, obviously with the stadium and the other properties owned by the club, you mentioned the club office, which kind of sits out in the forest as well, a little bit further out. protecting these things is all important as well, and you'd imagine that they'd have that at the forefront of the mind when any development comes up. But really, really, really fascinating club, and I'd urge any of our listeners to at least watch a game, or if you're able to get tickets, then go along and pick them up, because it's been really, really interesting kind of looking at them through these kind of lenses within heritage over the last few years, and all the different I suppose sort of layers playing off against each other, but obviously at the end of the day coming together and being able to kind of push ahead with this really, really unique thing that's now competing at the top tier of German football. I mean, it's really, really special, and I don't think it's something that they necessarily would have seen themselves doing even a decade ago, but it's really, really impressive, and the model that they've adopted is being absolutely fantastic. But of course, you've got another book coming out yourself. You want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, yeah. That's coming out on the 6th of June, just before the Euros. It's called Played in Germany, and it's effectively a kind of literary, journalistic travel guide to Germany, if you like, to football Germany. So it's sort of portraits and profiles of the different cities and regions that will be hosting the Euros through football, looking at regional culture and German society more broadly. So yeah, it's a sort of little book that I've done just before the Euros, and it's available to pre-order now already, and I think Waterstones and Amazon and stuff like that, and it'll be out on 6th of June.
Perfect. Well, all our listeners can go and have a look at that, and please also pick up Kit's other book, Scheiss, We're Going Up, which is effectively the story of Union Berlin. As I mentioned, there's a lot of fan stories and a lot of fan takes in it as well, which just really make it absolutely fantastic. The work that went into it was amazing, and it's certainly up there as one of my favourite football books as well. So I can't thank you enough for coming on this podcast. It's been a really, really great episode, and it's been great having a chat with you about all things Union Berlin. Is there anything else that you want to mention just before we finish up for today?
Not at all. It's been a huge pleasure. The only parting note that I have is as I say, do go to Union, but don't buy a £200 ticket on Viagogo because they will hate you.
Brilliant advice. Of course, if there is an episode that you want us to do or a topic that you want us to cover, please do get in touch with us. You can DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. We'll leave those details in the show notes just in case. Also, please check out our website, footballheritage.co.uk. That's where all of our written content goes, and some of the stuff that's going up there from our wonderful contributors is absolutely fantastic. So please do go and check that out and support them if you're able to. We cover everything from club histories to lost football clubs, former stadiums, the careers of players, topics surrounding the identities of fans, clubs that are particularly political, anything revolving around football heritage, identity, culture, community, place, you name it, we'll cover it. Just get in touch with us and have a chat. We're more than happy to speak with you about that and see if it's something that we're able to do. But for now, Kit, say goodbye.
Goodbye.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.